Every church has hidden systems. No, not the ones you wrote down, but the ones everybody just knows. It's those unspoken rules, those repeated patterns, those cultural defaults. They're not in your playbook, but they're discipling your people every week. So the question is, are they discipling them on purpose or on accident? We're going to answer that today. Welcome to Church Made Simple, where churches thrive when everyone knows what to do and why it matters. We replace confusion with confidence so your team can serve with clarity, ownership, and purpose. Today, we're going to talk about the hidden systems that your church is operating in. Nobody really talks about it, but everyone is doing it. Before I do, though, if you haven't already, subscribe to this YouTube channel, or if you're listening on Apple Podcasts or Spotify, be sure to subscribe. Share this episode with somebody else, somebody in your team or somebody at another church. Help us get the word out that we are trying to make church simple again. And I also want to encourage you, sign up for our newsletter. There's a link in the description. I'm going to let you know every time a new episode drops. I'll also be sending you free resources and things that are going on in the ministry so that you never miss out. Let's build this Church Made Simple community online together. Let's talk about the hidden systems your church is operating in. You know, most churches only systematize operations and not their discipleship. Systems aren't designed to disciple, but they do disciple. The culture of your church is actually shaped more by systems than you think. I think a lot of times pastors think that culture is shaped by the sermons they're preaching. We preach a vision series, we preach a generosity series, and we think that that's actually shaping the culture. But the reality is, your church's culture, it's being shaped by the systems that no one's talking about. So that means that every recurring pattern, every communication rhythm, every leadership habit, these are the things that are discipling your people, whether that's good or bad. So if you don't identify those systems, you can't change them. And if you don't change them, well, they're going to keep shaping your church silently. So what are hidden systems? These are what I like to call the invisible disciples of your church. They're nowhere written in your values. They're nowhere near your mission. They're not talked about in your vision, but they are lived out in your church's behavior. Here's some examples. How people are corrected, or how feedback is handled. What about how time is honored, or how time is wasted? Yeah. Who's allowed to speak up in meetings? What kind of stuff gets celebrated? What kind of stuff gets ignored? Here's a tip for you. If it happens repeatedly, it's a system, whether you meant for it to be or not. There are culture-shaping systems in our church. And I want to give you 4 invisible systems that you have to bring to the light. You have to expose them if you want to disciple your church intentionally. The first system is this, the system of celebration. What gets celebrated will always get repeated. So you got to ask these questions. What is it that we highlight publicly? Ask who gets recognized and for what do they get recognized? Ask what stories are we telling on Sundays? The more you talk about something, the more you celebrate something, you are building a system into your culture that people need to do that thing. I remember talking to a pastor, and my gosh, he was struggling because people would not give financially. They weren't tithing, they weren't bringing offerings. He wanted to do a building campaign, he wanted to move buildings, could not get people to give at all. And I said, when's the last time you talked about giving? He said, we take up an offering every single week, Stephen. I don't know why they're not giving. I talk about it. We need your money. The Bible says to give. And I said, okay, let me rephrase my question. When is the last time you celebrated the church's giving? When is the last time you celebrated your church's generosity? Hey, let's cross over into a different line. When is the last time you celebrated that your church as a whole was able to be generous with somebody else outside of your church because your church, the people in your church, are giving financially? And he goes, I don't know. I said, well, there's a problem right there. Every single week, your church should be celebrating people's generosity. I said, every single week, I want you to get up and I want you to thank your church because they give, the lights are on. Because they give, you get a salary. Because they give, your church is being generous with missions organizations around the world. Simple things. I said, just start celebrating it. And as you do that, over the course of a few months, you will see your giving increase. And guess what? He did it and giving increased. Why? Because what gets celebrated gets repeated. Do you publicly praise your team members? And I don't mean just from the platform, but I mean among the people publicly. Do you recognize individuals for living out the mission of your church? If not, maybe you need to start celebrating. Celebrate behind the scenes, not just platform performance. If you want more humility, more service, or just more generosity, put a spotlight on those things. The second system that we have to expose is the system of correction. You know, correction gets a bad rap because correction is a part of discipleship, but a lot of churches out there are either avoiding it altogether or they're abusing it. Now, I want to speak to this for just a second because there are a lot of people, I can't stand this term anymore. They call it church hurt. Why don't you go to church? Oh, because I experienced church hurt. The church hurt me. And I've had conversations with people who say that to me. And as I dig deeper, my mature brain is going, nobody hurt you. They just called you out on something you were doing wrong and asked you to correct it. They attempted to make your life better by asking you to correct something in your life that was not aligned with the mission and vision of your church. And you didn't like that. And you're calling it church hurt just because you were hurt. You weren't abused. You just were misaligned. Oh, okay. So how do we create a healthy system of correction? Because it exists, but we need to make sure that it is healthy. We don't want to avoid correction. We also don't want to abuse correction. So we need to answer some questions. How do we confront sin or immaturity? Because those are, by the way, two different things, okay? One of the worst ways you can confront sin in a church is by immediately assuming that it is a spiritual issue. Now, I try not to get too theological in this podcast particularly. I save that for my YouTube channel, Stephen Kilgore, under Stephen Kilgore Ministries. But let's talk about this. Sin does not always necessarily mean that there is this demonic problem or a spiritual oppression. Yes, it can be that. Sin is literally, most of the time, just habits in my life that I carried over from my old life. My brain has been wired in such a way to curse, to say these things, to act this way, to abuse this substance. And so when I get saved, the Holy Spirit begins to sanctify me. So if the Holy Spirit is gently sanctifying me and pointing out and convicting me, why is it that the leaders in my life are screaming at me at how I'm not really saved and how I'm not really a follower of Christ because I keep doing these things? Maybe we need to have a system of correction that confronts sin through healthy conviction, points it out biblically instead of societally. I've said this to people before in sermons in our church. Not everything that's a sin to you is a sin to somebody else. And I'm not going to dive too deep into that. I'll let that sink in a little bit. How do we confront immaturity? That's another one. I've never been good at that. Honestly, I had to really work to get better at that. There were years where people were immature and I would show grace. Immaturity doesn't need grace. Immaturity needs discipline. So how do we confront immaturity? What kind of conversations do we have? Another thing we need to ask is feedback reserved just for emergencies or is it open? And what kind of feedback is open? And what kind of feedback is only reserved for emergencies? If the only feedback you're ever getting as a leader or a team member in your church is only when something goes wrong, that's an unhealthy system of correction. Correction is not just about emergencies. Correction is about every single week. I use this example. My daughters are 5 and 8 at the time of this recording. And they very rarely actually rebel or act up or get, crazy on me. But you know what? Every single day, I do find a way to encourage them and correct them. And sometimes my correction is not they did something wrong. My correction is actually setting them up for a life stage they're going to go through in the future. So in other words, my correction is more like a seed sown. I'll talk to them about something that they'll face in the future. Right now, in this season of parenthood, I've been talking to my daughters about what it means to be loved by somebody. My daughter, who's 5, she learned in daycare, because she goes to a Christian daycare, and learned here at church that we're called to love people. Well, I agree with that. And as a pastor, a kids ministry should teach your kids that. But as a father, I need to explain what that means, because it's not my team member's responsibility in 60 minutes in a service to explain the depth and theology of people loving you or you loving people. So I've actually been correcting my daughter's mindset of what it means to love people and what it means when people actually love you. She didn't do anything wrong, but we have open feedback on these things. Here's another question. Do people feel safe bringing up their concerns to you? If you're leading a team and people don't feel safe, they feel intimidated, you have an unhealthy system of correction. How about this? Do people never bring up concerns? This is a huge red flag. If you're a leader of any team in a church and you haven't heard anyone's concerns in the past year, past 6 months, heck, probably even the past 30 days, there's a problem there. And when I say concern, I don't mean like anxiety-driven concern, but just, hey, I saw this and I want to go ahead and fix this. Or, hey, I saw this, what do you think about this? So we want to build a culture of real-time feedback, not silent judgment or delayed explosions, because correction done well creates growth and simplicity. Correction done poorly simply creates fear. Let's talk about the next system, the system of communication. So how your team talks becomes how your team thinks. So we need to ask these questions. Do we over-communicate or under-communicate? Some things can be an email. Let's just say it. You don't have to have a meeting about everything. In fact, most of the meetings that churches are doing out there are just, I don't know how to describe this. They're just egocentric timeframes where the pastor can talk about things that he is doing. And your team doesn't need that, pastor. Or if you're a lead of a ministry, you have to have a meeting with your team. Why do you have to have a meeting with your team? This could be done in a text message or an email. Stop over-communicating just for the sake of saying, we communicate. And then on the flip side, what about under-communication? That's when you know you need to speak out and you don't whatsoever. You get lazy, or you say, they'll figure it out. You got to have a healthy system of communication. Ask the question, are we clear or are we just busy? Are we clear or are we just busy? So do we have meetings just to fill time, or do we have meetings because we need clarity on something? Meetings don't have to happen. Communication doesn't have to happen just to feel like you're doing something. And then, what's the tone of our texts, our emails, and our team chats? This is a very ugly situation in a lot of teams, and I'm going to use my personal experience to talk about this. I served at a church where the pastor used fear and intimidation to rule. It was very unhealthy, and yes, it was abusive. Now, there were a lot of things that were good, but that abuse is what you walk away remembering, right? Whenever he sends an email, in response to an email you sent, or just out of the blue, it terrified you because it was just a one-sentence email. And you just assumed, because he was an intimidating figure in your life, that he was angry about something. So here's what happened. I got fired from that church, went on to a job in the world, okay, not like a secular job. And I remember I was getting emails from my boss. And because I had had this wiring of my brain that whenever your leader emails you, they're angry, you need to be intimidated, there needs to be fear driving you to get something done, I would freak out. And he saw this in me. And I'll never forget, he came to me and said, Stephen, your emails are so long. Like, you're over communicating. I just sent you this one request and you're sending me like 12 pages of things and I don't understand why. I said, well, it's just because, I'm afraid that, you're upset. And he said, listen, from now on, I want you to think this way. Whenever you see an email from me, I want you to read it as if I'm smiling and saying it to you. Listen, if you're a leader, people cannot interpret the tone of your texts, your emails, and your team chats. People interpret based on how they feel in the moment. But if you set a precedence that, hey, every time I send you something, unless I say otherwise, I want you to read this and interpret this as I am smiling when I send this, it will make things so much better. So go audit your last 10 messages to your team. And would they say that you lead with clarity or you lead with chaos? Because your words will create culture, so you've got to use them on purpose. Lastly, the system of time. This is key for churches. Your calendar is a major part of your culture. So you need to ask, why are we always rushing? Why do we always feel like we're doing busy work? Why are we always doing things last minute? Ask, what do we always make time for? And sometimes what you're making time for is not good. Ask, what does our schedule teach people to value? Hey, when you're in a church and every day is a different event, you are teaching people to not value their family time. You are teaching people to not value their work time. Woo! Be careful about what you're putting on the calendar because you might be teaching your team to value things that are unhealthy. You might be teaching your team to value busyness over health. If your planning meetings are rushed, but your run-throughs are super long, you're probably teaching your team that preparation doesn't matter. So you need to start structuring time around what you want to multiply. So if you don't name these invisible systems, they will keep creating confusion. They will keep undermining your values. They will keep discipling your people in ways you never intended. So don't just ask, what do we believe? Ask, what do our systems actually teach? Listen, your church already has a discipleship system, and it's not your small groups, it's not your sermons, it is your invisible weekly rhythms. So start here. Audit what gets celebrated. Clarify how correction happens. Tighten up that communication and align your calendar with your church's values because culture will form either by design or by default. And I would rather us choose design. I want to help you with this, so I've got some free resources. If you sign up for our newsletter with the link in the description, I'm going to send you a link to our resource vault where you can download the Culture Audit Toolkit. It's going to show you 4 worksheets that'll evaluate your hidden systems. It'll give you a culture health checklist. And there's also a team discussion guide that's going to help you bring everything together as you discuss this with your teams. I want your systems to start shaping people on purpose. And in the next episode, we're going to get hyper practical. You're going to learn how to systematize your guest experience without turning it into a script. Hey, a warm welcome is not just about hospitality. It's about helping people find home. So I want you, if you haven't already, subscribe to the YouTube channel or on Apple Podcasts or Spotify. Sign up for our newsletter so you get all the free resources. Until then, keep leading with clarity and keep making church simple.